Hello, everybody, and welcome to Breaking Ish. I'm going over the January 6th committee report, and we're in the Appendices section. So if you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and let's keep it going. Just a few housekeeping matters. You might see a big dog come up, and that dog is my co-host. And you might hear my dog making licking sounds, obviously because he's licking himself. And there's really nothing I can do about it. So please bear with me and welcome our co-host whenever you see him. His name is Lala. I also want to let you know that I will not be going over the transcripts. I'm just going over the main report. If you want, I welcome everybody to read this report and the transcripts and any other documents with it, because I believe that it is perhaps the most important government document that is publicly available for Americans today. Uh, Even 2 years after the insurrection, most Americans don't understand. No, many, I shouldn't say most, a lot of Americans don't understand the true nature of what happened on January 6th. Uh, it was an attack on our democracy, it was an attack on the rule of law, it was an attack on hundreds of years of history and tradition. And somehow the current GOP doesn't seem interested in focusing on that threat. And we're seeing that happen with the stonewalling that's ongoing with House committees. That's already started. They already asked the DOJ for to intervene in ongoing DOJ criminal investigations. The DOJ shut him down, but that's not going to be the end of it. Jim Jordan's going to subpoena, and it's probably going to end up in court. DOJ is going to win the case simply because the legal matter is in favor of the executive branch in a matter of legislative overreach, just like it was in the case of judicial overreach. But this is not how our government is supposed to work, where one branch attacks another branch constantly, and there's somebody who is puppeteering these attacks. This is not normal, and we are still in the middle of Donald Trump's attack on our republic. So with that, I'd like to dive right in. And now I would, like the last two episodes, I've been talking about law enforcement security lapses. And I will just continue with that. Here I start with interagency coordination. We describe certain reasons why deployment of National Guard was delayed, highlighting the activity of Secretary of the Army McCarthy and how he understood an order given by Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller. In our interviews with Department of Defense officials, we testified that they had asked the Department of Justice to serve the role of lead federal agency, meaning to lead the coordination and response on January 6th. The Justice Department does not command National Guard units. Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and Department of Homeland Security officials testified from each agency's perspective about the discussions concerning which department would serve as lead federal agency. Notably, these discussions occurred at the same time when President Trump was offering acting Attorney General position to Jeffrey Clark, replacing then acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen. Had Clark ultimately been appointed and had he been placed in charge of federal security response to the violence on January 6th, the situation could have been materially worse. And the committee says the situation could have been materially worse because we see how Jeffrey Clark reacted when he was offered the job of Attorney General. We saw how he was ready and willing to subvert our elections. He was Scott Perry's hand-picked yes man for Donald Trump. And if it wasn't for, you know, threat of resignation en masse by Mr. Rosen and the rest of DOJ staff, DOJ leadership, as well as White House lawyers, if they didn't threaten to resign, the situation would have been materially worse. The question of a lead agency remained an open, unanswered question at the end of the January 3rd call. Security officials couldn't agree on a lead agency to lead the security mission of January 6th as late as January 3rd. I mean, you have to understand how incredibly derelict that is. Realize it, January 3rd coordination call. This is from the report. Realizing that there had not yet been a coordination call among federal agencies engaged in planning for the January 6th events and related contingencies, Acting Secretary Miller convened one on January 3rd because nobody else was doing it. In addition, I mean, this is not how security operations are supposed to work. We already learned from the last episode I did how much information the FBI had, and we were only skimming the surface, actually skimming the surface of the surface of the surface. There's, what the committee is telling us is still the very tip of the iceberg. In addition to Department of Defense officials, including General Milley, DOJ, DHS, Department of Interior officials participated. Acting Secretary Miller's objectives were to ensure that everyone had the same perception of the threat and then figure out how to synchronize, coordinate. He wanted to make sure that the Department of Defense was prepared for any additional requests for support. DHS Special Operations Director Tomney remembered that participants discussed the threat outlook and estimated crowd of up to 30,000, not large for the district. The consensus was that 8,000 to 10,000 police officers would be available on January 6th, a force regarded as appropriate for up to 1 million protesters. General Milley asked the police participants on the call whether they needed any other assistance from the Department of Defense. General Milley and Secretary Miller expressed concern about the number of groups requesting permits and the attendance of the groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, who, as Secretary Miller explained, had conducted acts of violence in the past. General Milley noted the desirability of a law enforcement lead for coordinating the interagency planning and response effort, given the potpourri of jurisdictions and the diversity of agency authorities. Secretary Miller testified that he believed he and Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen were in agreement that the DOJ should lead interagency cooperation for January 6th. Although when asked during the call, Rosen did not confirm that the DOJ would play that role. The question of a lead federal agency remained an open and unanswered question at the end of the January 3rd call. The same day, Rosen was attempting to secure a White House meeting with Trump regarding the imminent appointment of Clark in his stead. So, I mean, I have to appreciate, and we have to appreciate the pressure under which Jeffrey Rosen was operating. We have to understand the constraints that Donald Trump had put on his own departments in a very tacit way. There was nothing overt about it. You have to understand something that Donald does. His modus operandi is tacit influencing. He is not one to make overt statements, overt acts. His overt acts are nuanced, and he makes other people do his overt acts. So his whole game is conspiratorial. And he's so good at it that he is able to cover his tracks to not be able to show the agreement, the meeting of the minds between him and his other lackeys. And the way to break that cycle, is to get people like John Eastman and Mark Meadows to cooperate with the January 6th investigations by the DOJ and to flip them so they can testify against Donald Trump. John Eastman and Mark Meadows' liability and Rudy Giuliani's liability is extremely high. And if they were to flip on Donald Trump, if any of those three were to flip on Donald Trump, it would be bad news. If more than one of the three were to flip on Donald Trump will be going to prison, and that is for sure. The question is whether they will or not. I want to reiterate something that I said in the previous episode. It's okay for American citizens, regular, ordinary American citizens, to criticize government officials for failing to do their jobs. I maintain that government officials as senior as General Milley did not fully understand the nature of the impending threat. They didn't assemble a quick reaction force, didn't think the guard was necessary, and waited until 2 days before January 6th to set up a security operations center. And 2 days before the insurrection to have a meeting of all the agencies. The report reads, on January 4th, interagency call with the same group, Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue made DOJ's role clear. It would take the lead in certain areas of responsibility. Although he stressed that the DOJ was never designated lead federal agency, it could not serve in that capacity. On the evening of January 4th, the FBI established a Strategic Information Operations Center at FBI headquarters, 2 days before the insurrection, which became operational on January 5th, day before the insurrection. Unlike the previous summer's civil protests, Department of Defense did not have a representative at the Operations Center. All Department of Defense officials who were interviewed by the Select Committee, however, believe that the DOJ agreed to take and may have even been assigned by the White House the lead coordinating role. Director Tomney, however, remembered that the DOJ participants neither agreed to nor explicitly declined lead agency role. So that's dereliction of duty right there. Like, you're dilly-dallying about something like this when there are numerous threats coming in? During January 3rd and 4th calls, General Milley, according to Donahue, noted that there should be plenty of police forces available without using federal military troops. He was adamant that no active duty troops would be deployed on January 6th. During this call, participants also discussed whether there was a need for a police-based quick reaction force and concluded that the size of the Metropolitan Police Department and Capitol Police forces would make that unnecessary. They were wrong in their assessments. And I keep repeating that they were wrong in their assessments because these people, General Milley and Director Tomney and all of these people in their leadership roles, and not just any sort of mid-level leadership roles. These were acting attorney generals and joint chiefs of staff chairmen and the level of National Guard leadership at the very top, Christopher Miller, and these people were at was it Christopher Miller? I think his name is Christopher. Acting Secretary Miller, all these people, they were well aware that there were threats coming in. Many, many threats coming in. Unprecedented threats coming in. Specific threats coming in about what was going to be attacked, who they wanted to kill. And still, they concluded that military support would not be necessary. They didn't conclude that it was a fluid situation and they should be monitoring it. They didn't conclude that there was plenty of semi-specific, semi-credible threats for them to keep contingency plans in case something happened. And we will learn later on that commanders on the ground did that, but the leaders who were making the decisions did not. So maybe we need to have a change in leadership here. It's important to note that while various permits were granted on January 6th, no agency granted a permit for the march from the ellipse to the Capitol on that day. Okay, so just a sort of caveat here. Not a caveat, sort of an explanation, sort of a side explanation here. Whenever there are protests in our country, the protests are not free for all, especially when coming to places like state capitals and federal capitals, federal capital of Washington, D.C. When you want to protest in Washington, D.C., you have to apply for a permit from the respective authorities, whether that be D.C. or whether that be Capitol Police. I don't know who you get the permits from, but there are many entities, these law enforcement agencies, they issue permits that allow you to protest. Without these permits, you are not allowed to protest. These are time, place, manner restrictions that are applied on our right of expression so as to weigh against the government's interest of maintaining peace and tranquility and for the general welfare of the public. So, general welfare and safety of the public. And so these permits, without the permits, protests are illegal. And so it's important to note that while the Stop the Steal rally at the Lips there were many permits for it, and there were other permits for other areas where there were stages and speeches ongoing, the walk from the Ellipse to the Capitol on January 6th was not granted a permit by any agency in Washington, D.C. on that day. 3 organizations in the National Capital Region handle permits for organized activities depending on where the planned activity is to occur. The United States Secret Service issues permits for the Ellipse. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department issues permits for areas around the Ellipse. The Capitol Police handles permitting for activities on the Capitol campus. All 3 entities, as well as other law enforcement agencies, communicate about applications for permits and the expected number of attendees. They are reluctant to deny permits for what appears to be First Amendment protected protests. The Capitol Police received, evaluated, and approved 6 group permit requests on January 5th and 6th activity on Capitol grounds. At no point was any permit granted for a march from the Ellipse to the Capitol. Donald Trump planned to announce that march spontaneously. So that echoes back to the off the record movement, the OTR movement that Donald was planning. Now we go to January 5th Congressional Briefing by Chief Sund and Paul Irving. On January 5th, Chief Sund briefed the chairperson of the Committee of House Administration, Representative Zoe Lofgren, along with numerous staff, as well as House Sergeant of Arms Paul Irving. Given CHA's oversight of Capitol Police, which was an opportunity for the chair of the committee to hear from the security professionals of the security plan, Chair Lofgren's staff director described it as a top-line briefing that covered various aspects of the security plan, including Chief Sund's direction of all hands on deck. His focus on the prospect of counter-protesters, as well as Chair Lofgren's concerns that members of Congress speaking at the lips that day could incite protesters. After the briefing, the CHA staff director was specifically asked about the availability of the National Guard in case it was needed. Chief Sun said that the Guard could be activated with an emergency declaration from Capitol Police Board, but they are here. They are a phone call away, and if we need them, they are ready to go. We learned later on that that wasn't the case. Speaker Pelosi did not receive a similar briefing, but her chief of staff was given a readout of Chief Sun's briefing to Chairperson Lofgren. On that basis, as well as assurances Chief Sun provided, the Speaker's chief of staff said, "So I believe the Speaker believed the security professionals were in charge of the security and were prepared. We were told that there was a plan, and we now know there was no plan. There was no lead agency that was assigned. It was all, we don't need the military. It was our departments can handle it." And then he goes and says, Chief Sun goes and says, all hands are on deck, and that, they are a phone call away, and if we need them, they are ready to go. We learned later on that that wasn't the case, but Chief Sun said that to Zoe Lofgren anyway. You see why I think there's a dereliction of duty here? He did not take the threat seriously. Based on assurances provided, he believed, congressional staff believed, and the Speaker believed that the security professionals who were in charge were prepared and that they had a plan. But we see that they didn't have a plan and they weren't prepared. But ultimately, the biggest wild card in all of this was the security professionals could not factor into their threat assessment Donald Trump's betrayal. Despite the fact that he incited in open and plain view, they still couldn't factor that in, and I don't understand why. We are supposed to look for threats to our republic. Our republic isn't a person. Donald Trump was holding an office. We as Americans need to know the distinction between politicians and the offices they hold. The offices they hold are public offices. We, the people, have the right to ask our public officials and require our public officials to behave in a manner that complies with the rule of law. When it doesn't, no matter who they are, even if it's the President of the United States, our officials in their leadership positions have a duty to factor in intelligence as it comes, the way it comes, not with rose-tinted glasses, or in this case, tangerine-tinted glasses. Although intelligence was available suggesting potential violence at the Capitol, it was not apparent exactly that what President Trump would do to provoke the crowd on January 6th at the Lips rally. Chief Sun, for example, drove into work on January 6th believing that preparations for the day's events were sound and there was no extraordinary risk or threat. On my way in, I called Inspector Glover with the Metropolitan Police Department just to get a read. He said he was actually parked over by the Lips. Asked him, "Hey, how are things going?" And he said it was fine. Acting Attorney General Rosen met with FBI leadership for a briefing that morning. He remembered this briefing, unlike previous ones, as more than a situational update, adding that DOJ was going to hope for the best, prepare for the worst. They didn't prepare for the worst. At 10:43 a.m., Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue received a call from Matt Blue, Acting Chief of Counterterrorism Section, stating There are no credible threats as of 10 brief. 12 minutes later, Rosen spoke to White House counsel Pat Cipollone via phone. Acting Attorney General Rosen admits that in hindsight, no one at the department contemplated how bad that afternoon turned out to be. Nobody in DOJ leadership could have predicted President Trump's actions that day. Well, honestly, there was enough information in the public domain for them to make that assessment. When somebody says something and they keep on saying it and they double down on it and they do so for the course of 2 months and it's happening in open and plain view, for you to say that there's no credible threat means that you had your head in the sand. That is what that means. It doesn't mean that you had an accurate threat assessment. It doesn't mean that you had all hands on deck. You lied, Chief Sund. You lied, Acting Attorney General Rosen, Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue. You people did not do your jobs. You all dropped the ball. They dropped the ball, guys. There's no other way of saying it. And, I get angry every time I read these excerpts. And I get angry because, Chief Sund is out there and General Milley is out there. They are, giving excuses, writing books about this. When their dereliction is now recorded forever in the January 6th report. Anybody who reads this cannot say in their right mind that these people in the top leadership positions in law enforcement in our country made the accurate assessments. They didn't. They categorically failed. And I believe General Milley needs to resign because he was at the very pinnacle of that power and he decided to dilly-dally. Like, you don't take the time to see what's happening out on the streets just because you're so high up in leadership. Your head is up in the clouds and you need to be brought back down. So, I will leave this episode with, I want you to pay attention to the fact that these law enforcement chiefs, and they're coming out with their books and their excuses. I want you to read the report. I want you to read the Appendix 1 about law enforcement lapses. And then I want you to ask yourself the question about whether you would consider what they did to be prudent, what leaders should be doing in situations like that. You go ahead and you read that and you tell me that from these excerpts, it does not make clear that these leaders in their leadership positions failed on and before January 6th. They didn't have a response team gathered 2 days before the insurrection. They didn't have a plan, and then they went and told the Capitol board that they had preparations and that all hands were on deck. They said that they had made the preparations when in the previous meeting, internal law enforcement meeting, they talked about not arming the guard, that a guard wouldn't be necessary. So why were they giving out inconsistent statements? They were saying one thing amongst themselves. They were saying something else to the members of Congress. They're saying they were prepared, and then we will learn in the episodes that will come up in the next couple of days that the commanders on the ground actually defied the orders of those higher up and stocked up on civil disturbance unit gear, including batons and riot shields and stuff like that. But they did so in defiance of order of higher ups because they saw what was happening. So that inconsistency right there, if nothing else, is enough to show how woefully unprepared the leadership was. The police officers and law enforcement on the ground did their jobs. They bled for our country. While the people who were up at the very top, they are still to this day making excuses. They are making excuses, and I haven't heard Chief Sund or General Milley come out once and acknowledge their mistake in making leadership decisions, in not taking it seriously, in not understanding that Donald Trump is a man, and the office he was abusing the powers of the office that he holds. And that is a dereliction. That is a failure on a fundamental level. And I want Americans to know that. Okay? Hey guys. Hey Steve, Zoila, Derek, Deb. You all are here. How nice. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate all of you. So please like and subscribe and share. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Derek. I've been talking about this for over 2 years. Yeah, Lawrence O'Donnell needs to have me on. If that happens, from your fingers to God's ears. No, it's not about me being on someplace, or I just want the information to get out, Like, I want people to forcefully ask for explanations because they owe us explanations, They owe us explanations. General Milley owes us an explanation for why he didn't take a firmer stand. Chief Sund needs to explain to us why he was telling his law enforcement meeting that there was no need for military assistance, and he was telling Zoe Lofgren that all hands were on deck and they were just a phone call away. We learned later on in the appendices that even after they tried to make phone calls, they weren't being mobilized. So if they aren't being mobilized, that means the plan was not in play. Why wasn't the plan in play? Because there was no coordination team, no intelligence gathering team that had been organized even 3 days before the insurrection. Like, how much more derelict can you be? And how blatantly would you just, come out? Like, it's some sort of shamelessness for you to come out and defend yourself preemptively. I wish media would pick up on it. I really do. I really wish the media would pick up on these failures and talk about them. I hear people in the media talk about how the committee did not talk about security lapses, law enforcement lapses. Well, I'm reading the report. All of you who have downloaded the report, Deb, you have downloaded the report. I don't know if the rest of you have downloaded this report, but if you have, you've downloaded the report. Read the report. Go to Appendix 1 and you will read it. It's right there. So why is the media coming out and saying that the committee didn't talk about these things instead of talking about the things that the committee talked about? And I'm sorry for confusing you. But I'm reading these excerpts. You hear the excerpts and you read them and you tell me that you don't think that that was a dereliction of duty. And you tell me, how am I finding that information out? I'm not in some sort of a government position. I'm reading the publicly available report. If I can gather this information and you can assess this information from what the report reads, why isn't the media? I have read more articles from Washington Post and other news sources that complain about what the committee has excluded, but not one segment in one news where they have gone out and asked Chief Sund, General Milley, Paul Irving, Christopher Miller, Jeffrey Rosen, these people, explanations. No, we wait for their books, so we buy their books and we feed into this capitalist cycle. I'm sorry, but my republic and democracy is more important to me than capitalism. And capitalism and free market that our country champions would not be there if it wasn't for our republic. So In my mind, my republic comes first. And the question for the media is, why are you still waiting? What are you waiting for? You're not going to get any more information about this. And there's still plenty of information that you need to inform people about. So, sorry for getting riled up. I'm a little excited that y'all are here. I really love it that you're here. You guys have been so supportive of me on Twitter. You followed me for this many years, dealt with my crazy hair and my dogs, and I'm going to keep on coming back, and I'm going to keep on reading these excerpts, and I'm going to do what I think is necessary to explain to whoever will listen the reality that is in open and plain view. Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Derek. All right, I'm gonna go now. Ta ta. I'll see you all tomorrow.